Well, welcome everyone to Municipal Ordinance and Solar Siting. We have today with us Beth Woolfolk, the Manager of Renewable Energy Planning and Policy at A Climate to Thrive, and Abby Farnham, the Assistant Director of Policy and Research at Maine Farmland Trust. We're going to start off with Beth talking to us a little bit about ordinance and siting in general, and then Abby's going to speak a little bit more about how we thread that needle and make sure we protect the multiple values that we have on our landscape as we move towards a decarbonized future. So thank you. And Beth, you want to take it away?
Great. Thank you so much, Tanya. Just give 1 second. So if you're here today, you're probably thinking about solar for your municipality, or you're noticing the increasing amount of solar development in the state and you want to learn more. Next slide, please. If your town or municipality hasn't already developed a solar ordinance, I'd like to take time right now to encourage you to do so. Maine has established pretty ambitious clean energy goals, and nationwide, NREL predicts that PV development will roughly expand 8 times past what it is today by 2050. By proactively planning, your municipality can channel solar development into areas where your community decides it's acceptable and encouraged, rather than reactively instating a solar moratorium. Next slide, please. So the first thing to consider is that solar arrays make for good neighbors when sited and maintained thoughtfully. They are generally a pretty low impact form of development. They virtually have no moving parts, and so they don't tend to make a lot of noise. Inverters and other electrical equipment make a little bit, but it generally sounds like the hum from an air conditioner at the very max. So they're fairly quiet neighbors compared to other forms of development that could potentially go in certain areas. They also have very low glare. A common misperception is that solar arrays will cause glare or act like mirrors. But sunlight that is reflected as glare is not producing electricity. So the modules are designed and constructed in a way to minimize glare by using a low glare glass to maximize the absorption of electricity. Next, oh wait, sorry, back one. It's also worth noting that solar projects that are on the larger size come with a lot of extra requirements from the DEP. They're known as site location development permits, which typically coincides with the Natural Resource Protection Act permit. And these prohibit significant negative impacts to sensitive wildlife habitats, wetland water quality, groundwater, soil erosion, stormwater, noise, and scenic characters. So site laws like this are required for all projects occupying over 20 acres. So these projects already come with regulations and protection for wildlife. But it's still really important that the town or municipality considers their space as well. So next slide, please. Another factor to consider is the utility grid. And this is more so an issue for Versant Power territory than CMP. But in general, projects sited less than a mile away from the existing electricity interconnection point, known as the point of common coupling, will be more competitive price-wise. This is because there are significant electrical infrastructure upgrades that come the further away you are from a substation. So the closer it can be, the better. This is also in some ways a good thing because it prevents these solar arrays from sprawling into undeveloped areas and keeps it kind of concentrated towards the electrical infrastructure. And so these limitations are will limit options for grid connection, and will limit the number of multi-megawatt scale projects in any given town, at least right now, given the regulations in Maine. Next slide, please. It's important to prioritize construction on pre-disturbed land. It's an excellent way to make use of property that might not be used for housing or anything else that's feasible, and it'll concentrate the development of these renewable energy projects in a space that doesn't harm habitat, forests, or use farms or other open spaces. So it's really good to prioritize these pre-disturbed lands and large rooftops if possible before opening it up to other land. However, developing on these sites often comes with a greater cost of installation. For example, traditional post-mounted solar racks cannot be installed on capped landfills. Instead, they're mounted on cement blocks in order to ensure that the hazardous waste and contaminants aren't released through the construction of the solar projects. Next slide, please. So thankfully, there's a tool to help planners and developers consider a lot of these factors. The Maine Audubon put together this renewable energy siting tool, which is absolutely fantastic. It brings together data sets onto one map and allows the visual display of siting principles developed by the Maine Audubon's biologists and ecologists. And so it'll show the electrical system infrastructure layers, the ecosystem and habitat layers, and really highlight pre-disturbed land where they're encouraging the development of these renewable energy projects. Next slide, please. So before I pass it off to Abby, I wanted to highlight a few other best practices when considering solar development. One is to apply standards to solar installations based on area, like acres or square feet, rather than capacity. This is in order to avoid the codes from becoming outdated as efficiencies and technologies and utility business models change over time. So deciding that you want it to be limited to 5 acres as opposed to 2 megawatts, as those 5 acres will generate more and more electricity as the technology improves. You also want to ensure that there's a reasonable decommissioning requirements. So oftentimes large-scale solar developments require a decommissioning plan for the end of a project's life, or in the event that the facility is no longer in operation. The terms of most large-scale solar facilities land leases generally have those decommissioning requirements and assurances. And further mitigate the abandonment risk. If you're requiring a bonding, if you're requiring these installations to have a bond for decommissioning, make sure it's those regulations are commensurate with other forms of development that have a similar lifespan, in order to avoid claims of arbitrariness when it comes to decommissioning, because those can also really limit the development of solar in some ways because of the financial burden that comes with those decommissioning plans. So making sure that they're in line with other projects of similar life and size is really important. And finally, when a project does apply or is coming to the planning board, use a proactive approach to community engagement. In general, Maine people overwhelmingly support solar power as long as it's strategically and thoughtfully sited. As specific solar projects are proposed, make sure that you educate and provide spaces for the community to listen and vocalize their questions and concerns. And yeah, just really prioritizing that community engagement. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Abby, and we'll have resources and time for questions at the end.
Great, thank you. Let me just share my screen here. Okay. Let's see, can everybody see that okay? Great. All right. So this is just a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about today. Just reviewing kind of why it's important to establish balance between supporting renewable energy development and protecting agricultural lands, as well as some guiding principles for when farmland is sited or when solar development is sited on farmland. And then I'm going to review 3 town case studies of kind of how they developed their solar ordinances and kind of different provisions that minimize the impacts to agricultural resources that were included. And then just give a brief update on some just relevant state legislation related to advancing balanced solar siting. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Maine Farmland Trust, we're a statewide member-powered organization. We work to protect farmland, support farmers, and advance the future of farming in Maine. So we have a network of over 330 farms who we've partnered with to either protect their land with an agricultural conservation easement or provide business planning or soil health technical assistance. And then we also work at the federal, state, and local levels to support policy that supports Maine agriculture. So we have been very engaged in the issue of solar development and farmland for the past several years. So Maine Farmland Trust very much supports renewable energy production on farmland and on active farms, as long as it doesn't significantly diminish the potential for agricultural production. So farmland in Maine is unfortunately being lost to all types of development. So it's really important that we find the right balance between supporting solar development while also ensuring that we have the land base we need for a robust food economy as well as for food security in our state. And it's also really important as we're kind of learning more about the impacts that solar development is having on farming and on farmland, that these projects aren't just displacing current farming operations or impeding farmers from being able to access the land that they need now and in the future. So we created this solar siting guide for towns in collaboration with the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry. We released this last summer, and much of my presentation is based on that information. And I can provide links to it, and we can also provide printed copies of this guide if anyone on your town boards or committees would kind of benefit from receiving that physical copy. So this is a set of general solar siting guidelines, some of which align with what Beth was speaking to as well. These were developed by a group of Maine-based agricultural environmental organizations that could just be maybe helpful guiding principles for towns when thinking about how to kind of balance agriculture and solar. So I'll just highlight the first 2 here. Avoiding land that's classified by the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service as prime farmland or farmland of statewide importance. So those soils are the most conducive to productive agriculture, but they make up only 14% of the state's total land area. But also, avoiding causing productive farmland to be taken out of production. And I think really importantly here, this includes land that's leased for agricultural uses. We have heard from several farmers who are experiencing challenges in accessing land that they need as a result of solar development. So just kind of being really thoughtful about those impacts. Also using previously developed, disturbed or marginally productive portions of the farm property is a really important way to establish that balance. So there are, several ways towns can advance these guidelines through their land use tools that they're crafting to permit solar development. So this is just a list. This is just excerpts from the solar siting guide. This is just a list of some ideas, and then I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on some of these in the case studies. But we're always interested in hearing about siting strategies that towns are adopting to minimize impacts. So please feel free if anyone's aware of anything that your town is considering or that you've learned from other towns, feel free to drop it in the chat. That would be great to hear about. But just to kick off just the case studies here for the city of Auburn. They established a solar ordinance in 2020. And their approach was sort of establishing special standards for their agriculture and resource protection zone, which is significant. It makes up nearly 19,000 acres. But one thing to highlight is they determined that an array of any size could be permitted by right, as long as it's intended to support the electricity needs of the farm operation, which is a really important way to support, the viability of farming through solar development. And then the city of Auburn was in the process of establishing an agriculture committee when they were designing and developing their solar ordinance, and they wanted to have members of that committee be able to weigh in on solar proposals and how they might impact the viability of farming in the zone. So just as kind of a compromise, they decided to kind of put a cap on the total amount of solar that could be approved in the zone before the agriculture committee would require, that they would be able to provide input and required to kind of weigh in on those proposals once that committee was up and running. So a couple other kind of components of Auburn's solar ordinance I wanted to highlight were their prime soils analysis. So solar developers are required to provide a soils analysis demonstrating the extent to which the project would cover or to impact prime farmland soils. So this enables the town to kind of request a different location where not as much high value soils could be impacted. And it has been effective in that way for town officials. And they also require solar developers to include within their operations and maintenance plan kind of how the project will prioritize, integrating agricultural activities. So next I want to talk about the town of Reedfield solar ordinance, which Reedfield's approach was really to kind of leverage their comprehensive plan, and which had their established goals and priorities, including several related to protecting agricultural resources. They kind of felt like rather than reinvent the wheel, they could really kind of reference their existing planning resources. So they reference the comprehensive plan in several different components and standards of the ordinance. But one thing to note about this approach is that because the ordinance itself doesn't include specific siting standards, the onus is really on the planning board to apply the ordinance in ways that really advance the comprehensive plan's objectives. And then there's also the fact that comprehensive plans get updated and change. So, the revised comprehensive plans will also play an important role through this approach in kind of guiding how solar impacts the community. Another component of Reedfield solar ordinance is a lot coverage standard for solar installations, which, they intended, just in talking about kind of the process that they went through and coming up with this standard, they were thinking of it as a land conservation provision to kind of prevent, a parcel from being totally encompassed by a solar installation. But they also sort of acknowledge that, directing solar siting to larger lots could potentially put these lots, at greater risk for development. But related to this kind of strategy of a lot coverage standard, one thing we've talked about with some towns recently is just kind of whether or not, allowable lot coverage could be used as a way to incentivize those, dual use projects that kind of both support agricultural activities to be maintained simultaneously on the land where a solar installation is developed. And these projects can be more costly for the solar panels to be elevated higher and spaced out further to accommodate agricultural activities. So thinking about ways that towns could kind of incentivize these types of projects that also support agriculture. So the last case study I want to look at here is the town of Topsom, which they also adopted their ordinance in 2020. Similar to Auburn, kind of those projects that are an accessory use to the primary use of the lot are permitted by right. One of the an interesting component that Topsom included within their solar ordinance is a habitat mitigation fee, which aims to disincentivize solar siting on priority natural and working lands, as well as to partially offset the impacts of siting on these lands and kind of using those funds for land conservation. So they based this fee on their natural areas plan, which had kind of gone through a whole public process of identifying priority areas within the community, and establish a tiered fee system. and the Conservation Commission makes recommendations for how those funds should be spent, but they do need to be spent on natural resource or land conservation. They model their ordinance or this component of their solar ordinance off of their development transfer fee. But at the time we were producing the guide and kind of talking with them about their process, they had all of the projects that had been approved had, in some extent generated mitigation fees. So it was a little kind of unclear the extent to which this tool was serving as an actual disincentive. But at the same time, they were, anticipating that it would be generating significant funds that could be used for land conservation. And some other pieces of Topsom solar ordinance really kind of align with some of those guiding principles we were talking about earlier, just in terms of really giving preference for locating the system on degraded portions of the property. And then, I think I've seen this in several solar ordinances that, no topsoil or prime agricultural soil can be removed from the site during installation. And one thing that Topsom has found kind of going through the process of applying their solar ordinance is that the soils can still be significantly impacted by the construction during the construction phase of a solar installation. So they've implemented this practice of requiring weekly third-party inspections during that installation phase as a condition of approval, just to kind of ensure that those impacts to soils are managed. So lastly here, I just wanted to highlight just a couple pieces of state legislation that are very relevant to this topic of kind of balanced solar siting. There are many, many bills being discussed right now by the legislature related to solar energy development. But to highlight just a few efforts that Maine Farmland Trust has been working to support at the state level. This first bill would incentivize the siting of solar projects on previously developed or impacted land. And that includes land where PFAS contamination is significant enough that it's preventing agricultural production in the near term. So this would really allow farm businesses and families to realize some economic support from land that they can no longer use for agriculture. And then this second bill kind of is following that sort of mitigation fee approach that I talked about with the town of Topsom. So deterring renewable energy development on prime farmland soils and soils of statewide importance by requiring a mitigation fee when projects are sited on those lands. And then those fees would be able to be used for farmland conservation efforts. And that policy effort is kind of broader too with other natural resource impacts. And then this last bill is kind of related to what I've mentioned about kind of these dual use projects that support both agriculture and solar at the same time. This is just it's a very new field and there's a lot to learn. So this bill would create a dual use pilot program to really learn about how these installations, what sort of standards for solar development that's compatible with agriculture so that these projects can really be expanded throughout the state. And when I've been speaking with some towns about how to, support dual use at the local level, towns are really interested in more kind of standards that they might be able to incorporate into ordinances around kind of what they might be requiring of developers and what's needed to kind of both support the viability of solar, but also the viability of different types of agricultural operations. And this bill also incorporates just creating a publicly accessible database with the characteristics of projects that have been permitted or constructed, just so that we can all have a better understanding of the land use trends that are kind of being impacted, as well as the strategies that could be used to avoid the sort of overdevelopment of important natural resources. And that is the last of my presentation. I guess I did just want to note that we have a municipal policy associate, Thatcher Carter, who is available to provide some direct support to towns, including on the development of solar ordinances, kind of, especially within the context of kind of how an ordinance can be, different standards or provisions that could be incorporated to really minimize impacts to agricultural resources. So I could connect anyone with Thatcher as well. But thank you very much. And yeah, I think we might be moving on to questions now.
Thank you both, Abby and Beth. That was excellent. So this is your chance, folks, to pepper the experts with questions.
one of the questions I have is, we've been hearing lately that due to CMP's congestion on their lines, that there's up to a 4 to 5 year wait for new projects coming online. And that would kind of give us time to get our ordinances in order. Is there any truth to that?
It's true in some areas. It really depends on the substations and the projects that have applied and when they've applied. So in certain areas that there will be a 4 to 5 year wait for any project trying to interconnect. But for the most part, it's a really important step to develop your solar ordinance as soon as possible, so that those projects that that want to get in line we'll be putting that permitting in place ahead of time. So yeah, that's just to say, as soon as possible, implementing a solar ordinance that really targets the areas where you want to see developments and protect areas that you don't want development. It'll be really important. Because typically projects, from what I've seen, at least for projects in our area, they won't apply for the local permitting until they've moved through the interconnection permitting process. And a lot of times the local permitting is the last step for them to get the project off the ground. So.
And we are just at the point where the community action grants through the Community Resilience Partnership are about to be announced. So if your community is already enrolled in that partnership, there is funding available to support you working on your ordinance. And if your community is not enrolled, this is a great time to enroll and tap into those funds that are out there.
This is Randy Place from the town of Morrill. When I was listening to Beth's presentation, it was all going, really, she did a good job going through it until it came to decommissioning, which is where I felt her voice, she was kind of stumbling a bit. And that's the problem I'm having in the town of Morrill here. We have an ordinance that we just approved through the through our town meeting with some amendments. And when you get to the decommissioning portion of it, I ran into some pretty big problems when I reach out to our bank, our insurance company, some bonding agents, Senator Curry's office, regarding bankruptcies. And when I talk to these people, I don't get real clear, I can get no answer. Even Revision Energy, talking to Nate, their commercial solar guy, who hasn't replied to me recently because I asked these questions. When it comes to decommissioning, bankruptcies, projects that have not being used, where that money actually is coming from, because when I talk to the bonding agents, our insurance company, these bonds are going to be approved annually. And if they see any problems whatsoever, they're not going to renew the bonds. So my problem is, during decommissioning, is it going to fall ultimately on the taxpayers? So I'm guessing you folks probably have seen, let's take farming, for instance. I'd like to see, I can't get anyone to show me a bank or a bonding company who was actually going to show me their program, their process for making sure that the taxpayers aren't going to be saddled with the decommissioning. I've got notes here from Senator Curry's office, from the deputy director from DEP, and lays it out nicely on how the DEP is going to ensure these decommissioning and financial insurance plans are going to be in place. So I'd like to see one of those, because I can't find one. So if you folks could send me one from an established solar farm, and it can show me detailed decommissioning information, not information, the physical contract, blank out the names you need to show me who to contact, where if the town of Morrill would have put in a solar farm, who would we want to see for a bonding. And I don't mean Billy Bob's bonding agency from Sacramento, California. I want to know who's legitimately can bond these and guarantee the town of Morrill that 20 years from now, when things don't, when new technology arrives or whatever, and solar isn't as efficient as it really isn't all that efficient, really overall. But I mean, I agree with it should be an add-on to any other wind, hydro, whatever. I'm all fine with that, but I want to know the details of decommissioning, and I cannot find that even from the senator's office. It's mush. There's plenty of information on telling me how it's supposed to work, but I'm not convinced it's going to work. And I want someone to prove that to me. And I struck out for a year trying to find that.
Well, I appreciate you bringing that forward. I know that it's a really important point for pretty much any community considering solar or seeing solar coming into their town. And so, while I don't have that material on hand, I'll definitely start asking the contractors for more in-depth information about decommissioning. The large-scale developers that are doing the solar subscriptions, they should have good information about their financing and their bonding. And so have you tried reaching out to some of the larger developers like NextAmp or Blue Wave to see what they've provided other towns with in terms of decommissioning plans? Because there are some of the larger developers that are using installing the large scale subscription arrays. And so they would have that information and could give you probably a lot more information about where their financing is coming from.
Shouldn't that be something you guys should be resident experts on though? Because you guys are trying, obviously you're selling this whole thing. You should have a list. I mean, this isn't new now. This is what I'm running into. These answers are just like this, and it's just kind of frustrating when you look at how, take PFAS, for instance, what a mess that created by people not looking at that 20 years ago. And I think you folks really need to be looking at the future. And is solar really going to be something that's still going to be there 20 years from now? I think you should have those answers now. We shouldn't be figuring this out 20 years from now. If I had told someone 20 years, if I told that farmer 20 years ago in Farmington that I could see solar panels in his fields there, he would have called me crazy. And here we are.
Okay. First of all, I would like to say that I work for a nonprofit focused on small scale renewable energy that is intended to be developed on pre-disturbed lands and roof space. So we're not the large scale developers. Second of all, the materials used in a lot of these projects in solar in general are incredibly valuable. And so there are recycling programs that have been set up in other countries that are a perfect model for what we can anticipate seeing coming into the US. And so while I don't have the large scale decommissioning plans on hand or guidelines on hand, that's not to say that that hasn't already been established and addressed in other areas. But the truth is that the US is years behind other countries that have made leaps and bounds in terms of implementing this technology into their grid. And so it's not new territory. And yes, it will be viable in 20 years.
Thank you.
I think it's really interesting. I mean, in a way you're asking, we're trying to predict the future and how things are going to go. And that's always a challenge because we don't know. And I mean, like personally for me, I'm from coal country and, we've seen, big organizations declare bankruptcy and wiggle out of bonds and leave big mess for communities and the state to deal with and all these orange streams. And, we have been down these roads before with damage caused by power extraction. And so I think we're wise to be thinking about it. But and I think you are speaking some truth there about, those of us who are looking to assist towns if they're interested in doing this sort of work. These are the questions the towns are going to ask, and the more information that we can gather to help the towns make the decision that's right for them, the better. So we will be chasing things like that.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Lissa. I'm from the town of Freedom and on our Community Development Advisory Committee, which is a committee that's primarily looking at the redevelopment and reuse of an old, it's not an industrial site, but the old Schedul's warehouse site, if anybody in Waldo County who goes back 20 or 30 years remembers that. So, and the planning board is separate, but one planning board member and a select board member is on this committee. And so there's two different things. One is, I don't know the status of whether the planning board is interested in pursuing a farmland ordinance. I know they're having some conversations about it and we're exchanging information, but I'm not exactly sure where they are at the moment. We do have a wind ordinance because we have one of the first wind farms. And so the issue of decommissioning came up when we were doing that. And I won't bore you with the whole sort of saga that resulted in that project in our town. So on our site, and this isn't farmland, but it's sort of agricultural related. So we're looking at the multi-use redevelopment of the site is kind of, could be some open space and wetland protection. And there's some old foundations, and there's some conversation about an agricultural facility, like maybe a warehouse or processing or something. And we still have a lot of basic information to collect. And we joined the CRP and are awaiting feedback on a grant so we can do some more site analysis, including wetland protection. So what I'm getting at is like there's other kind of dual use, not with farmland, but looking at solar on, we're having this debate, internally, which is like, okay, do we use it on the open land where it's easy to install and so on, or can we kind of piggyback it on another on a building, basically that has sort of agricultural uses. So these are all very hypothetical scenarios, but I just didn't know how scenarios like that intersect, or if there are things we should think about, in our ordinance, if they do an ordinance that, and also where state, part of this is like where there are state funding sources to kind of facilitate moving forward. Like, there's like technical assistance, of course, with developing an ordinance. There's funding sources through CRP to actually maybe do some site-based work, so anyhow, just curious, like whether there are any intersections that we could be thinking about, and I'll find out, where we're at with a farmland.
So your
ordinance.
contact, Robin Stanicki,
Yeah.
is a good resource. She
Yeah.
can help you write grants to
Yeah, she's
do
working with
projects
us. Yeah.
well beyond community action grants.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we can help you with Department of Ag grants or Department of Energy grants if that's something that the town would like to pursue.
Yeah.
But we're there for you to do that. And if
Yeah.
Robin's swamped,
Yes.
she will kick it to me. So
Yeah, okay.
we'll take care of you if that's what the town wants. And it's always 100%, this is about what the towns want and what feels like the right fit for the town and the town's goals and interests.
And Tanya, I just want to say I really appreciate the emails that you send with all of the resource information. And I'm kind of the one who gets that and just tries to like send it to the right people.
Good.
So,
Well, good. I'm glad that's useful to you.
yeah. So,
Yeah, and that sounds like a really just interesting project generally. Yeah, I'd love to hear more about it. And I don't know if there's any way we can provide any helpful input or support at all, and just kind of, thinking through the agricultural pieces there. I know that sounds like, you have like lots of kind of different stacking ideas.
Yeah. So, there's some potential interest in, among, because we have, a concentration of, organic and vegetable farms in our area, as you know. So anyway, we'll see where it goes, but just wanted to, put it out there.
Yeah, and one approach to think about, which you very well might already have, is just kind of engaging some local farmers' perspectives in terms of kind of thinking about how the land might be used agriculturally, just kind of some of those considerations in terms of, and I'm not sure if any farmers serve on the community development board, like you mentioned. Oh, perfect.
Yeah. Actually, she's not a farmer, but Colleen Hanlon Smith is a resident in Freedom, and so that's sort of one avenue. Just again, she has a more hand on the pulse of like the distribution and
definitely
needs, and then Sean Murphy Family Farm. So we have a couple of farmers, and everybody's involved in, well, not everybody. Prentice is on the Grassy's on the committee as well as on the planning board. So that's why he's kind of handling the planning board solar business. So, but I know there's interest in it. I think there are some farms interested in solar. So
sounds really interesting.
Abby, I have a question for you. On your demonstration, talking about how Reedfield limited the use of certain agricultural lands to solar development. Now, most of those towns you were discussing all have comprehensive plans. Now, Montville doesn't have a comprehensive plan. So how do we go about limiting the use of certain high-level agricultural lands?
Yeah, well, to clarify, I don't believe there was any portion of their ordinance that like directly, and I guess, and yeah, for Reedfield anyways, maybe you were thinking of another town, but Reedfield, they leveraged the comprehensive plan, but it really was through kind of referencing kind of how the solar ordinance should align with advancing the goals and objectives that are included within the comprehensive plan. And some of those were related to protecting agricultural resources, but it didn't take the approach of kind of incorporating specific siting standards, say around trying to direct solar development away from agricultural lands. I think there were some, that's what the town of Topsom kind of tried to do that to some extent through their mitigation fee, the component that they had in that ordinance in terms of trying to, there would be a mitigation fee applied to solar developments that are sited on lands that were really identified as being, highly valued within the community. But that was based on their natural areas plan. So I don't know if the town of Montville has any established, whether it's a comprehensive plan or open space plan or any sorts of kind of existing planning resources that you could reference or leverage or kind of tie into the process somehow in terms of areas where the community had identified, agricultural lands or whatever it might be that were important. And I see, it looks like you're shaking your head that maybe that doesn't exist. Yeah. Well, then that's where it might make sense to, like, if your community, values, protecting agricultural resources, that's where it might make sense to see about whether it could be a good fit to incorporate specific siting standards within the ordinance that don't necessarily reference another plan, but that kind of would really get at the goal of protecting those resources.
Yeah, I just want to add, since we're neighbors, I'm in Freedom, and we have a pretty simple, it's again comprehensive plan. It's a whole other conversation, but I also think you can do an ordinance without a comprehensive plan. You don't have to have a comprehensive plan to do an ordinance, and for us, I think we've had a couple of iterations of like a comprehensive plan, and then it got withdrawn, and then it kind of got reinstated, and I think the wind farm, so it was like a precipitating event, and like one kind of core ordinance is like site development, like any kind of commercial development on property is like a way you can include wind and solar, and there's either a separate ordinance, which we went through the same thing with wind, trying to come up with an ordinance in concert with the project that got developed. So, but ultimately, I think that wind ordinance got folded in to a site development, and there's just a section on wind. And so maybe we'll do a section on solar that is equivalent. But so anyway, I guess my feeling is if it's an important issue, start there. Just start there and do a solar siting ordinance, and then it can always get folded in. But the benefit of a comprehensive plan is state funding, basically. That there are times, and it ebbs and flows. It has over the many years I've been involved in Freedom. It's like sometimes if the state has money, which it does now through the climate funding, there's a benefit to having a comprehensive plan, to point to. But
the history of Montville, and
what's that?
Comprehensive plans have never gone over very well here.
I know, it's probably why I built I have a cabin I built in Montville, so.
But we're looking at incorporating it into the site plan ordinance because we felt that would be the best way for us to go. It's just a component of site plan.
Yeah, and I just pasted in the chat, Maine Audubon, which Beth referenced, they have some really excellent solar siting resources that, including in the link that I just posted there, they have a model site plan regulation and conditional use permit document for towns, which might be a helpful reference for you.
This is Randy again from Morrill. This is a question for Abby on the, when I'm in Morrill, Waldo County, if people aren't familiar with the town of Morrill, but when I grew up here, there were a handful, a half a dozen dairy farms, from 30 to 50 head, and they were considered small farms, and anything over 100 was considered a large farm. Now all those farms have gone away because they just couldn't, make it over the years because they couldn't get picked up anymore by milk or whatever. Are you working as hard? I know you're working towards solar and using some farms for solar sightings, but are you working as hard to keep? I got a couple of friends who have 100 herd farms now, dairy, and they're kind of on the chopping block for being picked up. I mean, we're going to need dairy, we're going to need eggs, we're going to need beef. Are you working to maybe finding a way to keep those farms in business, or maybe even start up some smaller farms again instead of looking for a way to use the farmland? But how about keeping some of our resources here we need so we can just live and survive?
Yeah. Absolutely, that's a great question. I would say that is our top focus through our programming. So we have like I mentioned, we do business planning, technical assistance with farms just to kind of help them, reach their business goals. We do a lot with land access for farmers, trying to connect, a retiring generation of farmers with new farmers who are looking to access land. And related to the dairy industry specifically, yes, it's absolutely in an acute crisis right now. So we do a lot through our policy work, our state and federal policy work, to try to really support the viability of farming operations. And we're supporting a bill this legislative session that would provide emergency funding relief for dairy operations, because I know right now they're facing just like skyrocketing production costs and are just really in a point of really needing support to stay afloat. So yeah, absolutely. And to clarify kind of where we work within kind of supporting solar development is this, it's an issue for Maine Farmland Trust because it's an issue for farmland and farmers. And I think that farmers are certainly all across the spectrum in terms of opinions on solar development and how they can support farms and farm viability. We recognize that solar can provide a really important source of economic support for farms, but we also really want to support, farming and being a viable industry for agricultural production, and that, so that is definitely sort of our main focus there. Yeah, thanks for the clarifying question.
And in Beth's presentation, I think they talked about what 80% of Maine's electricity they'd like to see from renewable energy. I mean, I'd hate to think, I know, and we won't get into politics too much, but the administration currently in Washington is really pushing, obviously, renewable energy. And if they can get to that point through discouraging other types, like, getting access to farmland to put solar sites on, I'm worried that may be a priority for them and not looking so much into what you're trying to accomplish and keeping that farmland for farming and poultry and beef and as we talked about. It worries me.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the other thing I'll add too is we I mentioned Thatcher Carter, our municipal policy associate. So we do provide, direct technical assistance for towns. If the town of Morrill is interested in, other farm friendly municipal policy and planning strategies, you might already be working on several. But we are just in the process of finalizing a really broad ranging farm friendly municipal guide, Cultivating Maine's Agricultural Future. Working on the second edition of this. We produced the first version of this guide back in 2011, and we're updating it to kind of reflect a lot of recent tools and trends. So we can definitely provide that with you once that's available. And also, if you're interested in just kind of connecting after the fact about anything else that might be of interest, to the community of Morrill to kind of support farms and farmland protection, I'd love to talk with you about that.
Thank you.
So one thing I've become aware of, because I work for an economic development council, so we're really pro-business and especially pro-local businesses here in Maine, and especially in Washington County for Maine particular, is that sometimes, and it depends on the situation, these sorts of green energy projects can help stabilize farms. For instance, in my region, blueberry prices are up and down, and they're all over the place, and it's very hard for blueberry growers to make a plan and have a stable income with that. And so they found, for instance, marrying their blueberry work with wind power means that they have a stable check that they can count on, and then the blueberry prices move around, but they have that little bit of stability, which helps keep their farm viable. And the other thing that I think is interesting about this power, like solar power, is that up until now, when we look at the numbers on what people pay to heat their homes, it's astronomical, and it's just going through the roof. And that money doesn't stay in our community and recirculate. It leaves. It goes He goes to Texas, he goes to Saudi Arabia. It doesn't stay here. Whereas if we can work with local Maine businesses to produce local Maine power, that money stays in our community and supports our community, makes us stronger. Obviously, it has to be very thoughtfully done, which is why I've asked these folks to come and chat with us today, because there are a lot of questions, and there are always pluses and minuses anytime you're looking at a business coming in, and what's that mean for the community, for the pros and the cons. So I'm glad you're asking these really probing questions.
Well, we're talking about power. I mean, and help me out here because I don't really know the answer to this. But where did the hydro go? And I know this is. I mean, that was a very renewable energy, and I know there was a lot of things. I mean, we got technology now to help the fish get upstream and stuff like that. But whatever happened to hydro? That was a very constant, power source, I believe, anyways. But I could be completely wrong. But if someone could educate me on that, I would really appreciate it.
I think we've got the wrong crew for that.
No,
I had worked a bit with fish passage in the past, and some of the hydro dams were older and not producing as much power as it was costing to run things. But yeah, I think like solar farms, I think each probably hydro system works or doesn't work based on a lot of different factors as far as whether it's economically viable, and some of those hydro facilities went in quite a long time ago, and so the technology has moved forward quite a bit as far as what works and doesn't work now.
actually, my understanding is that CMP at least has the majority of its electricity generated through hydro, and that when Maine set its renewable energy standards of reducing by whatever by 2030, or whatever the goals were, some of it was like already met by the existing hydro that's in place. I don't know the exact percentage, but it's actually pretty high. And I think that's kind of like one of the rubs within the industry is that, again, I don't know what the percentage is. It's probably not going to go up. And that may be the barrier. It's not going to be more hydro, but we have a lot of hydro in place in this, in terms of the amount of electricity generated. A lot of it's at Wyman Dam, and some of it's.
I suspect you're right that we've sourced the hydro that we can source economically. Right. I mean, maintaining dams is very expensive and can potentially concerning for communities downstream. Having come from Johnstown, Pennsylvania, which was wiped out by a dam. So we are getting to the end of our hour. I just wanted to circle back since we've gone a bit wide here and talked about power in general, which has been fascinating. If there's any last questions or comments before we wrap up.
Well, I guess just one last thought. We've been talking a lot in the last couple minutes about these large-scale projects coming in, but we have to remember that a lot of these projects are also small, behind the meter, and owned by the community, not just these large-scale subscription services. So making sure that we are focusing the areas of priority development in areas that are already pre-disturbed is very important, but also ensuring that we allow permitting that allows for these farms to own their own source of renewable energy generation that would provide a source of stability in terms of operations. As Tanya mentioned, the price of electricity is going through the roof, and by allowing these farms to own some electricity generation, it can be really stabilizing for not just them, but other businesses as well. So just remembering that it's not all subscription solar, and making sure that we're considering all forms of development is really important.
Well, I'd like to thank you all for such a really interesting and thought-provoking conversation. This has been recorded, and I will put it on our YouTube page, on Sunrise County Economic Council's page. That link is in the chat now. It'll probably take me a day or so to get it mounted on there. But there's also other trainings, including an overview of solar siting and, I'm sorry, not solar siting, but solar municipal development in our region. So I suggest you give it a look if you're interested in in pursuing this with your town and you think it's something that might be the right fit for your community. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks.